Can we figure out how this vintage t-shirt was designed, and can we make that in Photoshop? Of course we can. Let's do it together. It looks like we've got this photo as one of the main pieces of this design, which I found through a long perilous journey through Google Images. However, I do believe that the graphic or the photo that is used in this t-shirt was actually illustrated and used this photo only as a reference, which I'm sort of sure of because this version of it on the t-shirt has details that just don't exist in the actual photo here, like these highlights on its jacket. And also you could tell by these sneakers, they just look more illustrated, and there's just illustrations all over this design. So I'm assuming, you know, they also illustrated the photo, but all we have is the actual photograph itself. Now, I don't want to do any illustration. All we have is this photo, but we can use a few magic tricks and filters to get this photo pretty close to that illustrated look. There's also this huge lightning bolt behind him, which we'll just pen tool in Illustrator and get sort of a similar shape going. It's got this distressed stroke on it, which is really cool. We can use a few textures and filters to get that same look. Logo here has a harsh blue to red gradient, and also that same sort of distressed look with the stroke on top of it. And it's also got some sort of grungy, liney texture obscuring the middle of it. So we're gonna achieve all that using some textures, the crystallized filter, and the filter gallery. This smoke trail going behind our subject is going to be sort of tough to do. I'm probably going to pen tool a similar shaped path in Illustrator and then use the width tool to get it all fixed up. The reason I'm gonna do that in Illustrator is just because it's easier to get a nice, smooth, curved path than in Photoshop, especially because I'm using a touchpad. But feel free to use Photoshop if you have a drawing tablet or whatever. We're gonna cross that bridge when we get there. I'm gonna make that in Illustrator, bring it into Photoshop, give it a blur, and then I'll give it that Xerox grain look by using grain and the threshold adjustment. This comic style fire is going to be tough as well, but we can actually recreate that entirely inside of Photoshop. No fire PNG overlay required. So I'm gonna show you how, but I won't spoil it. If you can ID this font, I'm gonna give you $1,000. All right, let me not get ahead of myself here. This font as well, I don't really know what the font was, but it's just a simple sans serif. So I'm just gonna use whatever sans serif I have in my library. All right, let's do this. I'm in my favorite document setup for t-shirt design. Everybody knows if you watch this channel, that is 16 by 20 inches at 300 DPI. Make sure your DPI is at 300. That's what I like to use. Just make sure your resolution is at 300 if for whatever reason you decide to disobey my commands, but whatever. First things first, let's bring in that photo of Mr. Young. We're gonna go ahead and mask him out here. We have a few choices. We can either be a demon and individually pen tool him out, or we could just use the godly select subject function in Photoshop by pressing W on our keyboard. That'll take us to the magic wand tool and pressing select subject right up here. And it's going to create a perfect selection of Mr. Young here, as you can see. Thank you, Adobe. Now let's create a mask by going down to here and clicking on this mask icon. I'm gonna take my rectangular marquee tool by pressing M on my keyboard, and I'm just going to select the other band member here. I'm gonna make sure that my palette is white to black. You can do that by pressing D on your keyboard, which is going to reset it. And then I'm gonna do Command Backspace or Command Delete on my keyboard to fill that selection with black within the layer mask. All right, so now we have our subject fully masked out. We do have a few hiccups here and there, like these little pixels that are peeking out, and also on his shoe here, it's just kind of all messed up. So I'm gonna go in with a brush, a hard brush, and just sort of fix this up within the mask. I'm going in with a hard brush. That's just a brush on 100% hardness, and I'm painting in with white to show this part of the image. Yeah, this was a pretty low quality photo, so the selection here is sort of like, especially on these legs here, you see as I paint in, just sort of getting a straight line to obscure all those little bumps and ridges and whatnot, because that's not going to look too good, you know, on the final design. Just sort of cleaning up the mask here, and then we're going to go do some effects on this. All right, we're almost done cleaning up the mask here. Let me just go and get a nicer selection on his fingers here. And by the way, if you're unfamiliar, all I'm doing is switching between black and white within my palette to either bring in parts of the image back or delete parts of the image using the mask, the layer mask that's on this layer. And you can easily switch between black and white on your palette by simply pressing X on your keyboard, and that will switch your foreground and background colors. All right, we fully masked him out, cleaned up the mask. Let's go ahead and size him up a little bit because he's a little tiny right now. Right around here is looking good. By the way, I'm gonna put this image and any other assets I'm using for this design in a link in the description if you want to design this with me. So go ahead and check that out if you want to follow along. All right, let's go ahead and give him that cartoon illustrated look. This layer is already a smart object, so that is perfect. I'm gonna go ahead and go up to filter gallery. And I already have these settings saved actually, but let me go ahead and make this smaller so you can see. The process for getting that Xerox or comic look is very simple. If you watch some of my other videos, you might know this already, but it's just a grain effect and then a stamp effect on top. You can also use torn edges if you'd like. I'm not going to go into that right now, but most of the time, as you can see, to get this really cool Xeroxy look, all you need to do is have a grain filter in the filter gallery set to pretty much whatever you want, regular or enlarged. Works great. And then on top of that, which you can add another filter by clicking on that plus effect layer down there. On top of that, you just add a stamp, which is in the sketch folder. So that's pretty cool. Quick tip for you. We actually don't need grain for this specific photo just because of how sort of low quality and botched and grainy it is already. So I'm gonna take this grain off. I'm gonna hide it actually. And all we need is the stamp filter on this. As you can see, just the stamp filter already gives us that really cool cartoonish look. And we can play with the light and dark balance as well as the smoothness slider here to get a different look. We're gonna have to drag the smoothness slider upwards quite a bit in the lower middle range, just because this is such a low quality photo and we don't want any of those artifacts appearing too heavily. So we just want to smooth those out. And then the light dark balance, I'm just going to adjust until we find a nice spot for it. Right around here, I think looks pretty good. So I'm going to press OK on that. But one thing I actually do want to do is add some detail back into the darker areas. So I'm going to duplicate this with Command J and go back and edit the filter gallery on this duplicate layer by clicking on that effect within the smart object. And then I'm just going to drag the light dark balance to the left to get all those highlights sort of peeping through. So I just want more of these highlights on these shorts and on these shoes and whatnot. So I'm going to click OK on that. And now I'm going to mask those highlights in where I want them. But before I do that, the first thing I'm going to do is put these two in a group and name that our subject, Mr. Young here. And I want to have this same layer mask on the layer mask of the group. So all I'm going to do is hold down Alt on my keyboard and drag the layer mask to the group. Now it doesn't matter what layer mask we have on the actual layers themselves because we have them in a group with that layer masked to the subject. So I'm going to go ahead and just fill this whole layer mask with black by doing Command Backspace on my keyboard and making sure black is the second color in my palette. And now I could take a hard brush and just go in and paint with white in this layer mask where I want those supplementary highlights. So I did want them on these shorts here and on these shoes as well, just for some extra detail. Looks good to me, except for this little haze and whatnot on the layer mask. It just needs some fixing up. So what I'm going to do is go to the layer mask of the group, and if I hold down Alt and click on that layer mask, I can actually see what that looks like projected onto my canvas. When I zoom in here, you can see there's a little sort of just errors like around the layer mask, like this very little hard to see wisp of transparency, and just around here, like especially on his hair, there's just some sort of wisps, some extra stuff, extra pixels that we don't want. So with this layer mask selected, I'm just going to go up to filter gallery again just to smooth this whole thing out. And I'm going to use these same settings, and as you can see, it gets rid of those little extra pixels around the mask of the subject. All right, cool, looking good. Now let's go ahead and color in our subject. I'm going to go ahead and put these two filter gallery layers in a group by selecting both of them and doing Command G on my keyboard. I'm going to name this group graphic, and then I'll make another group by clicking on this group icon down here. I'm going to name this group color, and I'll set the blend mode of this group to multiply. Now let's go ahead and add a color fill in here. So I'll go to the adjustments and choose solid color. Let's start out with his skin tone. I might change this later, but for now this looks like a normal skin tone. So I'll press OK on that. As you can see, it is masked to just our subject here, and it is only affecting only the white parts of that layer or that subject. And that is because one, we have this color group inside of this bigger group, which is masked to our subject, and two, we have the color group set to multiply, and that means it is only going to affect the lighter parts of the layers below it. So now we just have to paint in the skin tone where we want it. So I'm gonna go ahead and make this layer mask all black to sort of hide the entire color layer, and I'll go in with a hard brush and my palette, my primary color set to white, and I'm just gonna paint in where I want that skin tone. So according to the reference, it's just on his face, the hand here, and also on his legs down there. So I'm gonna go ahead and make sure I got that all right. Paint in his legs here, and then we can just rinse and repeat that process for the other colors in the graphic. So looking back at our reference here, we just got a blue color for his jacket and his shoes and socks. And that's pretty much it. And then the rest of it is just left white. So I'm gonna go ahead and duplicate this colorful layer with Command J, or you can just create a new one, doesn't matter. And I'm gonna empty the layer mask by filling it with black, which is Command Backspace on my keyboard. Again, making sure my secondary color is black. Then I'll do Command I to invert that so I can actually see what color we're applying. And I'll go ahead and choose the color by double clicking on the layer thumbnail and choose a similar blue to what we have in the reference here. I'm gonna go back in that layer mask and do Command I again to invert it and make it all black. and then I'll just paint in that blue exactly where I want it. So I'm gonna go ahead and paint it in on his shirt here and his shorts, which I know the reference is a little bit different than this photo, so I'm just sort of freestyling this. I'm gonna go ahead and paint in his shoes as well. And I actually like that the reference sort of detailed his shoelaces and the sole of his shoe. So I'm gonna go in here and do the same thing. So I'm gonna knock out the parts of blue by painting in with a black color here on the layer mask and knock those parts of blue out in the sole. And I'll just probably draw something up for the laces as well. So let me just get the sole done here. I think that looks all right. I don't know. We're gonna check that out later. So that's the sole. I think, I don't know if this is part of the sole or not, but I'm just gonna include it. Then I'm gonna paint in some of the laces as well, or knock out the blue rather. So we have the white revealing underneath it. Yeah, I really can't tell where the laces are, so I'm just sort of freestyling this one as well. I'm gonna go ahead and say that's, it looks like a lace to me. Also gonna add that quick detail in his sock right here. I believe that's his sock. I'm just gonna make that white real quick. All right, that looks pretty good. Now let's throw some layer styles on our subject. I'm gonna go ahead and click on the overarching group of our subject here, Mr. Young, and I'll open up the layer styles panel by double clicking, and it looks like the reference pretty much just has a black stroke on him. I might do a little more, but let's start off with that black stroke. I'm actually not going to use a stroke for that. I'm going to use a drop shadow, and you'll see why in just a second. So I'm gonna click on the drop shadow layer style here. I'm gonna reset this to default real quick. And this is not gonna be your default. This is the personal default that I have set. So you're gonna wanna actually copy these settings. The color I'm gonna make black, first of all. But for the rest of it, the spread is gonna be on 100 and the size is gonna be on 0. And we're just gonna play with the distance here. Maybe the size too, but most of all, just make sure the spread is on 100. That's because as long as the spread is on 100, which I'll display to you with white real quick, no matter how much I change the size, it is always going to have a harsh edge. If the spread was not on 100, we'd have these soft edges here, which we don't want. So make sure the spread is on 100, and we're gonna play with these other settings later. So I'm gonna change this back to black. Before I add this layer style, I actually have to change the background because we can't see what we're doing with this layer style until the background isn't also black. Otherwise, all we see is black. The reference design, he has this big lightning bolt behind him, which we're gonna add in a second there. We're gonna get there. But for now, I just wanna knock out this layer style. So I'm gonna go ahead and just add a colorful layer all the way down at the bottom here. I'll just make it a red real quick so I can see what we're doing with the layer style on Mr. Young. I'll go back into the drop shadow layer style. I'm gonna crank up the distance and maybe even the size as well to, I don't know, something low like 3. We can play with the angle here as well. As you can see, we're getting something similar to a black stroke on our subject, but it has a lot more character and sort of depth than a stroke because it is biased to one side as we play with the distance and the angle. So that's something cool about drop shadows, that you can sort of use it to replace a stroke or even make a stroke better. So I'm gonna keep the angle right on here, the distance on about 9 and the size on about 3. I also could duplicate this drop shadow by pressing on the plus icon here and play around with the angle, maybe bring it to the other side and then play with some of the other values here like the distance. Maybe turn that down to like 3 just so we have a slight stroke going on the other side. Something else I do want to add that the original graphic does not have is a sort of inner stroke or inner shadow to this. And that's just gonna help give it some depth. So let's go ahead and add an inner shadow. And we're pretty much doing the same settings here as the drop shadow. So we want the choke, which is the same thing as spread pretty much. So put the choke all the way on 100. And then the color I'm actually gonna set to white here. And then the size and distance is something that we could play around with. So I'm gonna turn the distance up quite a bit. I kind of like having this sort of white highlight coming across the left edge of his body here and the guitar and all. Sort of looks cool to me, adds some depth. So we're gonna go ahead and add that. I like it. Change the angle here as well. And I think that looks pretty nice. Okay, I'm liking how that looks. I'll press OK on that. And really quickly, I just wanna get rid of this sort of haze that we have on the back of our subject here. So I'm gonna go into color, create a new solid color, just keep that on black and then paint in that black along these sort of stray pixels that I have at the edge of him here, just because I want to be a perfectionist right now. All right, and our subject is looking good. Let's go ahead and add that big ass lightning bolt right behind him. Where do you find a lightning bolt vector or PNG that big? I couldn't find one, so I just made it myself in Illustrator. It was simple, took like 30 seconds. So I'm gonna go ahead and open up Adobe Illustrator here and show you actually exactly what I did. So I have this lightning bolt that I'm just gonna copy and paste into Photoshop. And all I did was open up a document of any size. Document size doesn't really matter in Illustrator. Take the pen tool with P on my keyboard and just draw out a lightning shape that looks sort of like the lightning shape in the original design. And I have that original design just sort of pasted in this document right here. Okay, this looks like shit. I'm gonna use the other one, but I have the original design pasted in this document just to have it as a reference. So you can just screenshot the design, whatever design you're referencing, throw it in Illustrator and start pen tooling up a storm. You can also just overlay your pen tool onto the actual reference itself if you want it to be exact, but I felt like eyeballing it, so that's what I did. So once you've done that, you have now a fat lightning bolt that you can use for the design. I'm gonna go ahead and copy this from Illustrator to Photoshop by doing Command-C on my keyboard while I have this selected, and going back into Photoshop and doing Command-V. I'll paste that in as either a smart object or pixels. If you want to edit it later, you can paste it in as a smart object. It doesn't really matter. I'm just going to keep it a smart object for now. Press OK on that. I'm going to scale that to a reasonable size, and I'm also going to rotate it a little bit as well, just to match the contours a little bit better of our subject. I might even want to rotate our subject back a little bit as well to get it sort of closer to the reference design, since he's sort of leaning a little bit more back here. And as I do that, you can see Photoshop's compositing system just entirely break down, which is really cool and awesome. Anyway, now I've rotated him back a little bit more, maybe even gonna vertically scale him up a little bit, which is sort of against the laws when working with images to not proportionally scale, but who knows? They're not gonna know. They are not gonna know. So we'll press OK on that. Looking just fine to me. Now we can place this lightning bolt exactly where we need it according to the reference. So I think right around here looks good. Maybe it's a little bit bigger in the reference. I don't know. Let's scale it up just a little bit. I know the bottom point is just right under his foot here. And then there's definitely not this much distance in the reference between the guitar and his, or rather the guitar and the top of the lightning bolt. So maybe right around here looks all right. We also need space for that logo to come in, so I'm just gonna make this, I don't know, right around here I think looks good, which according to the reference may be sort of accurate. Again, the bottom point of the lightning bolt in the reference is sort of at his shoe here, and the top point is just a little bit above his guitar. I think we're pretty close here. I might even drag this up a little bit to match the reference better. You could honestly spend hours on this, but I don't need the most faithful recreation ever of this design. Just need to get it 90% close. So I'm gonna stop here. Let's go ahead and match the color of this lightning bolt to our reference. So open up the layer styles by double clicking on the layer, select a color overlay, and then choose the color from our reference here. And now we wanna add a stroke, more specifically a distress stroke like the reference has. And there's a ton of ways to go about that. And one thing I wanna mention is that if we just add a stroke within the layer styles right here, say I add an outside stroke and I set the color to white and I turn up the size, we don't have any harsh edges on that stroke. And that's just how Photoshop works. If I were to do the stroke in Illustrator, we'd have harsh edges on the stroke. Or if I set the position to inside, then we have those harsh edges. So that's just something to take note of when you're designing a graphic like this. This graphic in specific, I think, has harsher edges on the lightning bolt. So we can either do the stroke in Illustrator or have the position set to inside. Just something to take note of. I'm just gonna do the stroke here within Photoshop to make this simple. So I'm gonna set the position to inside and I'm gonna change the size until we get something sort of close to the reference. I think it's not that thick in the reference, maybe something like, I don't know, 15 pixels or so. I don't know, it doesn't really matter too much. Let's just stick with 14 here before I get decision fatigue. And then we wanna add this sort of also black stroke within the inside, I guess, of the lightning bolt. And we could do that using an inner shadow, sort of like the same process we did on the subject here with that white inner shadow. Let's just make it black this time. So let's add an inner shadow and I'm gonna set this to default and make sure the color is on black and the choke is on 100. And now we can play around with the distance and the size and the angle. Since we have the stroke here set to inside or inner, we do have to crank up the distance and size quite a bit of this inner shadow to actually get it past the stroke so we can actually see it. Obviously, this is an exaggeration. We don't want it this big, but that's just something to keep note of. So I'm gonna change the distance to, I don't know, 10, the size to 20 or so. We'll just play around with this till we get something nice. I'm also gonna change the angle here so that it's mostly coming from the left side. I think that looks pretty decent. All right, let me just crank up the size a little bit more maybe. All right, that looks pretty good to me. Press OK on that. Now, how do we give it that distressed look that we see in the reference? Now, there's so many ways to do this. I'm gonna do what I usually do, which is a bit of a weird process, but I like it. So the first thing we wanna do is actually separate the layer style or the strokes from the actual layer itself. We want to have them on two separate layers. So how we can do that is by duplicating our lightning bolt here. On the first lightning bolt layer, all we want is that color overlay. So I'm going to hide the stroke and the inner shadow. And then on the second layer, all we want is the opposite of that. So I'm gonna hide the color overlay and that way we only have the stroke and the inner shadow. Now I want this layer to only appear with the layer styles, just the layer styles, not the actual content of the layer itself. To do that, we can go and change the fill all the way down to 0. And now we're left with this layer that is purely the layer styles, and this layer down here, which is purely the shape of the lightning bolt and that color overlay. And you can go ahead and name these as well if you really want to. So stroke, and then lightning bolt, whatever, don't gotta name your layers. First thing, let's get a sort of general distress going along this stroke. I want it to be more bumpy and have more ridges and just look a little bit more grungy. So what I'm gonna do is select the content of the layer. So hold down Command or Control on your keyboard and click on the layer thumbnail to grab a selection of that layer, and then make a layer mask on that layer of that selection. Then we can go into that layer mask by holding down Option and clicking on the layer mask. From here, we can do a few things. We can add some filters, we can add some grunge. My personal favorite way to go about this is just by going up to Filter, Pixelate, Crystallize, and then crystallizing this by whatever amount of pixels you want. Obviously, the higher you put this, the more distress it's going to get. I'm gonna keep it something low, maybe around, I don't know, 15 or something. Press OK on that, and then instantly we have the stroke super distressed. This is cool, but I really don't want it this distressed. So I'm gonna go back into that layer mask by holding down Alt and clicking on it. And I'm just gonna throw a Gaussian blur on this. Gaussian, I don't know how it's pronounced. I saw someone pronounce it the right way the other day, or heard someone pronounce it the right way. It's like Goys, I don't know how you pronounce that thing. To me, this is Gaussian blur. And on this channel, this is Gaussian blur. So that's what I'm gonna call it. I don't want to hear no Gaussian whatever, that's propaganda. This is Gaussian blur. So I'm gonna go ahead and set the radius to anywhere from 5 to like 15. This is where we're getting sort of experimental with this, and you can sort of choose the values as you go. I'm gonna just try some stuff out. So maybe set this to, I don't know, 8. We want to sort of obscure those rough edges a little bit. Press OK on that, and then we want to threshold this. Or we can actually either threshold this or do the stamp filter gallery. They're pretty much going to yield the same results. If we were to threshold, this is what it would look like, and it pretty much look the same with the filter gallery. And by the way, I have a keyboard shortcut for threshold. That's how it came up so fast. But just to show you the difference, I'm going to go up to the filter gallery now, making sure I have the layer mask of this layer selected, and going up to filter gallery and just choosing stamp here. Pretty similar look we got going on, and we're gonna even crank up the smoothness to just get sort of that general bumpy distress going, which is really nice. Let's press OK on this and go back to our actual layer. You can see that that distress is not actually showing up. And the reason for that is because the layer mask is sort of outside the bounds of the content of the layer itself. So I really zoom in, and you can see that the lightning bolt sort of stops here and the layer mask goes above that. So we just want to sort of choke in this layer mask a bit. And there's a very easy way to do that. So I'm gonna go back to the layer here just so we can see what's going on. Then I'm gonna click on this layer mask. I'm gonna go up to Filter, Other, and then Minimum. And this is going to choke in the white of the layer mask. And the radius here is just how much is going to choke that in. So I'm gonna choose like, I don't know, 3 or 4 pixels, just until we start getting in some details of that grunginess in the hills and ridges. So choking this in by about 4-ish, 5 pixels, sort of gets that grungy distress coming in. I'll press OK on that. And now we just have it sort of bumpy, right? But we want that actual sort of knockout grungy distress. So here's how we can do that. I'm gonna go ahead and duplicate this layer with Command J. Then right under that layer, I'm gonna create a black background. So I'm gonna create a new layer and just fill that in with black by doing Alt backspace on my keyboard. And that's gonna fill that in with my primary color of black. Then I'm gonna duplicate this black layer with Command J, bring it on top of that duplicated stroke layer, and go up to Filter, Render, Clouds. And then I'm gonna set this clouds layer to multiply it. And then just bring down that opacity a bit. Let's keep it at like, I don't know, 50 or something, maybe even 60, depending on how distressed you want this. You can also see in the reference here that the lightning bolt sort of gets more distressed on this edge and also just generally towards the bottom. So if we want to really replicate that, what we can do is add a levels adjustment right above this clouds layer and just bring the midtone slider to the right to darken basically the effect the clouds have on that stroke. And then we want to paint that in where we want it. So I'm going to invert the layer mask on this levels and take a soft brush, which is a brush on 0% hardness, and start to paint in the levels adjustment within the layer mask towards the bottom and this side of the stroke on the lightning bolt. And now when we process this, we're going to get more of a grungy look or more distressed edges on these edges of the lightning bolt, which is really cool. Now let's select all these 4 layers that we just did. So that's the levels, the clouds, the stroke here and this black layer and go ahead and make that a smart object, convert that to a smart object. Now let's go up to filter again, pixelate, and then crystallize. And from here, we want to choose a value that's a little bit less than what we chose earlier. As we can see, since the stroke was so thin, having the cell size all the way up here is just going to completely obliterate it. So I'm going to turn that down to about 6 or 7, depending on how distressed I want this. I'm going to go with, I don't know, let's go with 7 here. All right, it's going to run that crystallized filter. Then we can go ahead and run the filter gallery on this. So go up to filter, filter gallery, and then we're just going to use stamp on this. I'm going to turn the smoothness down a bit so we don't have those weird edges going on. And then we can sort of control how distressed this is with the light dark balance. So I bring that all the way up to 45. That is pretty damn distressed. If I bring it down, we get more of that stroke peeping through. So completely your preference here. Let's go with these settings. I'll press OK on that. And now we have that stroke beautifully distressed, and we have it even more distressed towards the bottom and on this side of the lightning bolt. If I wanted to maybe lessen the distress on one of these sides here, I could just open up the smart object and start painting in the layer mask of that levels to sort of hide those darker parts and bring back the lighter parts in that section of the lightning bolt. And then just save the smart object with Command S to update that in the parent document. All right, perfect. But now we got to knock the black out of this layer, and we can do that by opening up the layer styles here by double clicking on that layer and just dragging in the black slider for the blend if section of the current layer a little bit inwards to the right. You really only need to drag it like 1 or 2 pixels in. Just bring it to like, I don't know, 5 here. Now we have the black knocked out of it, and at this point we can also hide the original white stroke that we had in this stroke layer down here. So I'm just gonna hide that white stroke so that we only have the distressed stroke peeping out, and we also have that black inner shadow still operating. As you can see, we still have some red parts of the original lightning bolt layer peeping out of the distressed stroke that we made here, and we can fix that very easily by duplicating the layer mask from the stroke part of the lightning bolt, or that stroke layer, to the original lightning bolt layer. So holding down Alt on your keyboard, just drag that layer mask to the original lightning bolt, and now we get rid of those red fringes on the edge of the lightning bolt. And we're left with this really cool graphic of the lightning bolt with the distressed edges and that inner shadow, giving it some depth. Really, really cool. If I want to increase the, I guess, the size or the width of the stroke here, I can either do that by going into the smart object and then going back into the layer styles and adjusting the stroke, but I don't want to do all that. The easiest way to do it would just be to put this smart object in a group, and then on that group, open up the layer styles for it and make sure that stroke is white to, you know, match the other stroke. And now we just made the distressed stroke thicker by adding another stroke on top of the distressed stroke inception here. We also have some black parts or black pixels peeking out, which we could fix easily by throwing a color overlay on this group and just making sure that is set to white. And that's cool because now we can control the size of the distress stroke pretty easily, which is a nice little setup to have. All right, now I'm just gonna put all these layers in a group, everything relating to the lightning bolt in a group. So this group right here, the stroke and the lightning bolt layer, I'll put that in a group and just name that lightning. Now let's do the logo. So I actually just have a PNG of that, or an SVG rather, a vector of that logo that I got from Google. I'll drop that in the link below as well if you want to use that. I'm gonna drag that into my composition here, scale that up to size to match the reference, which I have right here. Put that below everything really quick. All right, so the logo looks about yay big in the reference, right around here, I'd say. One thing I noticed is that the C is sort of right next to the edge of the lightning bolt, and the A is just about a few pixels off from it. It's also rotated in tandem with the lightning bolt. One thing I'm noticing otherwise is that Mr. Young's guitar is actually touching the D in AC/DC. So we can either make it bigger, make the lightning bolt smaller. Photoshop's compositing system, just a mess. No words for this. All right, I think that's pretty accurate to the reference. I'm gonna leave it like that. Okay, now back to the logo. I'm gonna rotate this a little bit in tandem with the lightning bolt, just how the reference has it. So just slightly rotate it to match the angle of the top of the lightning bolt. I think that looks pretty decent. And on this logo, we have a few layer styles very similar to the lightning bolt actually, except we've got a gradient overlay of that blue to red. So let me go ahead and do that real quick. I'll check on a gradient overlay. I'm gonna make the first color the blue. I'll just pick the same blue that I use on his shoes and around the rest of his body, and then I'll choose the red on the other side of the spectrum, the same red that we did for the lightning. And then we want to make this pretty much a harsh gradient. So I'm gonna change the scale all the way down to 0, and then I'll go into the gradient editor here. I'm gonna drag these color stops until they just meet each other in the middle. It doesn't even have to be exactly the middle, but just drag them until there's a harsh line between them, pretty much till they're right next to each other holding hands. That's okay on that. As you can see, when we zoom in here, there is that harsh gradient, that harsh transition between the blue to the red there. And that's exactly what we wanted. I'm also going to rotate it a little bit by changing the angle here as well of the gradient. I'll change that to, I don't know, 90, or maybe 85 or something like that. Just something to slightly match the curve of the lightning bolt as well. Definitely not 87. All right, 88 it is. I'll press OK on that. And we actually want the transition from red to blue to match the top line of the lightning here. So let's go ahead and drag the AC/DC logo down a little bit until we see that happening. Right around here is where it is at in the reference. So now I just want to bring the actual gradient overlay down until it matches the top line of the lightning bolt. So I'll just double click on the gradient overlay here and simply drag up or down on my canvas to match that line up. I'll press OK on that. And then we pretty much just have to do the same exact process that we did with the lightning bolt. So we're gonna pretty much just copy that exact layer style or do the exact same thing. So I have my AC/DC logo layer here with that gradient overlay. I'm gonna duplicate that with Command J. And on that second layer, I'm going to copy the same layer style from the stroke of the lightning bolt. So I'll just hold down Alt on my keyboard and click and drag on that effects icon all the way to the second duplicate of the AC/DC logo. I'm also going to name this stroke just so I know what I'm working with. Again, I'm going to turn the fill all the way down to 0. Let me turn that white stroke back on. And then we just have to mess with these values a bit to get it looking just better for the logo. Since it is much smaller than the lightning bolt, the layer styles are a bit overpowering right now. So I'm gonna open up these layer styles and just turn some of these dials down. All right, so this is what I've ended up on for the layer styles for the logo. I'll press OK on that. And now I'm gonna repeat the same exact process that I did on the lightning bolt to distress the stroke on this logo. And to save time, I'm either gonna do that off camera or speed it up because this is getting pretty long. All right, so that was the same exact process that I did for the lightning bolt. As you see, we got the distress stroke group here with the stroke and the color overlay on it, just like the groups for the lightning bolt. And that smart object, that's the actual distress stroke. And under that, I have the other layers, which is this inner shadow layer, which is pretty much just the original stroke layer, which we hided that white stroke to make way for the distress stroke, but we kept the inner shadow and set the fill to 0. And that's what's giving us that black inner shadow. And right under that, we have the actual fill for the logo, which is that blue to red gradient. And then I put that all in a group and named it logo. I'm actually going to add one thing to this. So on the layer with that fill set to 0, pretty much the stroke layer, I'm going to open up the layer style for that layer and just add a drop shadow just to give it some extra depth and separation from the lightning bolt. So these are the settings I'm using. I have the size at 3. Again, the spread, make sure is on 100. And then the distance and angle you can play around with. This is giving it that nice depth and separation from the lightning bolt. So here it is with it on. Here it is with it off. Big difference, but very subtle change. So I'll press OK on that and the logo is almost done. We just still need to add the weird sort of grungy distressed lines that are within the logo in this reference. So we can honestly just use a texture and throw a texture in here and clip that to the logo, sort of like a liney texture, but I'm feeling funky. So here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna select the fill layer, which is the layer that has that gradient overlay on it. And right above that, I'm gonna create a new layer. And on that new layer, I'm gonna go up to filter, render, and then fibers. Now the settings for this don't really matter, but you can pretty much see what we're doing here. We're rendering these lines, these strokes down the canvas in a random manner. Pretty cool, like unknown filter. I can't really see many uses for it, but I mean, this is clearly one of them. But other than this, I don't really know. So anyway, sorry, I was talking, I didn't even notice, but rotate that by 90 degrees so that we have the fibers going horizontally. And then we're just gonna align this with the gradient overlay that we have, that blue to red gradient. So I'm gonna rotate it just a little bit to get those lines more lined up with that gradient. Then I'll throw a levels adjustment right on top of this, and I'll do something similar to what we did with the clouds. I'm just gonna drag the midtone to the right to make the fibers darker. And then I'm gonna invert the layer mask on this levels and using a soft brush, paint in where I want the pretty much heavier or the darker fibers. So I'm gonna paint in with a soft brush on the top part. So just like the reference, let me bring that up real quick. In the reference, the grungy lines are sort of more pronounced towards the middle of that gradient. So that's just what I'm doing here. So let me bring back the layers I'm working on. And yeah, like I said, I'm just painting in the layer mask of this levels to make that top part darker. Then I'll select the levels and the fibers layer. I'm gonna convert them to a smart object and just run a filter gallery filter on this. Same thing we've been doing, just run stamp on this, and that gets us these really cool sort of grungy line texture. So pretty interesting method if you want to use this for anything else. But anyway, I press OK on that. Turns out I was wrong. I'm actually dumb. So instead of having the levels make the top part of this darker, we should have actually made it lighter. So my mistake, I'm gonna go back into the smart object here and simply just drag the mid-tone slider of this levels from the right side to the left side. So now that part that I painted in on the levels is brighter instead of darker. We go ahead and Command S to save that, go back into the parent document. Cool, so now we can see that actually where we painted in with that levels, we have those heavier lines. And of course, we're gonna wanna clip this to the actual fill of the logo. It looks a little ridiculous right now. So this is a pretty rough version of doing it. It's not, you know, super faithful to the reference, but I like how it looks. And now we need to mask this to the actual logo. So I'm just gonna hold down Alt on my keyboard and drag the mask from the fill logo layer to this fibers layer that we have here. And now we have that grungy line texture masked to the logo, except it's inverted and we still have the black background in here. So I'm gonna do that same method we did before with the blend if. I'll just open up the layer styles of this layer, drag in the black for the current layer to get rid of that black background. And now we wanna make the fibers black. So let's go ahead and put this in a group with Command G, and on that group, throw on a color overlay and just set that to black. Cool, pretty easy. Okay, so that's looking pretty close to the reference, I'd say. We can even go in and change the smoothness of that filter gallery effect, maybe to get a little bit closer and maybe get those lines a little bit thicker. So I'll change the smoothness up a little bit. So a bit of an unconventional method, but it worked. So that's pretty cool. Now let's do what we've all been waiting for, this cartoon fire here, which is going to be quite an interesting ride. Let's get to it. So like I said, for this fire, we can actually do this entirely inside of Photoshop. You don't need any PNG overlays of fire or anything like that. You can make that fire inside of Photoshop, and it's a really cool method. Let me show you. But right off the bat, let me just make a group for the fire, just to preempt that. I'm gonna make a new group and name it fire. Then I'll make a new layer inside of that group. And on that new layer, what you wanna do is take your pen tool, which is P on your keyboard, and just draw a line. So click on one point and then click on another point. I'm gonna go from here to here. Just draw a line. And then we can go up to filter, render, and then flame. And this is going to render a flame on that path. So these settings by default aren't gonna look like this. I've done a lot of messing around with these settings, but to be honest, this filter is pretty or super variable actually. So even if you copy these settings exactly, your fire is just not gonna look like mine. It's gonna look different on every single successive number you change within these settings. So you can use my settings here, my numbers, as a guide, but then you just have to play around with this until you find a flame that looks good. So let me go over the settings real quick here. For the flame types, I'm using multiple flames path directed. You can also use multiple flames one direction. That's just something to experiment with. The length just depends on obviously how long you want the fire. For this specific graphic, I'm trying to get it close to the reference, so I'm gonna just be experimenting with the length. And the width here, same memo pretty much. Angle, pretty obvious setting. And then the interval is how much spread there is between the flames. But you do want to go into the advanced tab and mess around with these settings, especially the turbulent and the jag and the opacity, the complexity, and all that. The opacity I'm keeping pretty low at 9 because you see if you go higher than 20, it just gets super overblown. So I'm keeping that really low at around 9 or at 10. The turbulent and the jag are just things you want to play with to get the flame customized to your liking. I'm not really sure how to explain what each of these do. You just really got to turn the knobs until it looks cool. That's just graphic design, all right? Turn the knobs until the thing looks cool. The flame complexity you do want to mess with though. The higher you turn this up, the more fidelity the flames have, the more detail they have, and the lower you turn this, the less detail they have. So that's something you want to play with. The flame style and the flame shape, just keep flame style at normal. You can go to violence, but I'm just keeping it at normal. Just avoid flat. This looks like shit. So I'm gonna keep it at normal. The flame shape, this honestly doesn't really change much, I've noticed, but I'm keeping it at spread, or you can also go to the center. You're really just messing around. It's hard to tell what's gonna affect what. What I was doing when I first originally just quickly mocked up the recreation of this design was just try a bunch of different flames and see which one looked the best. So it's gonna take a little bit of experimentation. If you really want, you can go ahead and go on Google and just search up a fire PNG or a flame overlay. But I like how the render flame looks within Photoshop, because for the reference we're going for, that flame is sort of cartoonish. It looks stylized, it looks illustrated. And when you get a flame PNG off of Google, it's a real flame. It looks super real. And even when you do the effects on it like we're gonna do, it ends up just looking like a cartoonified real flame. And the flame renderer in Photoshop kind of gets us somewhere in the middle of that. So this obviously doesn't look like too good of a flame. It doesn't look super real, but that kind of works in our benefit for this specific design because we want more of our cartoony flame. And once we do the effects on that, you'll see that it looks good with this specific sort of flame look. So yeah, pretty much just play around with these settings until you find something you like. For this specific design, it's kind of hard to get a flame that just follows the contours nicely or just looks nicely along with the rest of the design. Either way, once you think you found a flame that looks nice, go ahead and press OK, and it's going to render that flame onto your layer. I'm actually just going to be using this flame that I had rendered earlier just because I think it looks nice. So the first thing you want to do when you have your flame rendered is turn it into a smart object. So just right click and convert to smart object, and then go inside of that smart object by double clicking it and make a new layer in there and just fill it with black. So I'm doing Command Delete on my keyboard to fill a new layer with black. I'm just dragging that behind the fire layer. Then I'll do Command S to save the smart object. I'll go back into my parent document here. And now we're gonna throw a filter gallery on this. So let's go up to filter gallery, and we're just using the classic stamp and grain. We're adding grain this time. So the first effect that you wanna have on this is grain. We're gonna set the grain type to regular, and we're gonna play with the intensity and contrast later. Then we want to add a stamp on top of that, which you could do by adding a new effect layer with this plus icon here. I already have the stamp here, so I'm going to go ahead and show that. And then I want to take the light and dark balance and just adjust that until I find a nice spot for it. I also want to crank the smoothness up a bit to give this more of a cartoony look. Then we just want to adjust the light dark balance till we get sort of a super flat and blown out flame here. I'm going to go ahead and use this, click OK on that. By the way, I had turned the intensity down on the grain a bit just so we don't get too much detail in here. We want this to be pretty cartoony, so turning the intensity down on the grain sort of helps to do that. All right, so now we've got this filtered flame. What we're going to do next is knock out the black like we did with the other times we did this sort of effect. So go into the layer style and just drag the black slider of the blend diff of the current layer inwards a bit. Then put this in a group. We're going to name this group Dark Flame. And then I'm gonna go into the layer styles of that group and add a color overlay. And for the color, I'm just going to use the red that we used for the lightning bolt. And I'll press OK on that, press OK, get out of there. And then just duplicate this Dark Flame group. I'm gonna name this Light Flame. Then let's set the color overlay within the layer style of this group to a nice yellow. Then I'm gonna go out of this layer style and go back into the filter gallery of this layer of the light flame. So I'm gonna open up the filter gallery and just turn the light dark balance all the way up. Well, not all the way up, but up until you get sort of the opposite of blown out flame. So a pretty like dead flame. I might also go into the grain and turn the intensity down here as well, so we get less of a detailed grainy effect. So I'll turn the light dark balance of this just a little bit up, maybe 48 here. I don't know, maybe we turn the contrast of the grain up or something, I don't know. All right, around here is looking good. I'll press OK on that. And then once I press OK on that, you see that we have a sort of two-tone flame thing going on here. And it looks like a cool cartoon flame. So that's a really cool way to get this nice flame effect going in your designs. I might even want to mess with the smoothness of this top layer here. So let me go ahead and crank the smoothness up a little bit. We turn that to, I don't know, 13 or something, press OK. There we go, looking pretty good. We are getting closer and closer to our reference here. I also think the flame is behind the lightning, so I'm just gonna drag that behind the lightning. I don't even know if I like that. I might even make my own executive decision here and put it in front of the lightning. I don't know, let's see. Bring it back up in front of the lightning. I do think that looks better for whatever reason. I might just keep it like this. All right, so the flame's looking good. We're gonna add all these extra details later. Let's knock out this big path of smoke behind our subject here. Like I said earlier, we're actually gonna comp that up in Illustrator and then bring it over to Photoshop. But again, if you have a drawing tablet and you just think it would be easier to do in Photoshop, just go ahead and do it in Photoshop. I'm using Illustrator here. So this is just how I'm gonna go about it. I'm gonna go ahead and hide my reference here and then take a screenshot of the design as is. And on a Mac, that's pretty easy. It's what, Command Control Shift 4. And I'll just drag out where I want my screenshot and then I'll copy it to my clipboard. Then I can open up Illustrator and paste that image in wherever I want. I'm gonna paste it right here. And it's already dimmed because I have this this whole layer set to dim images, which you could do just by double clicking on the layer and having dim images to whatever %. And that just makes it easier to see what's going on here. Then I can just take a brush and start brushing out a sort of line similar to the reference over here. So it's just sort of a squiggly, it's like a cartoon path of a missile. I don't know how you describe that. Just like a squiggly S to the flame. So all the way from the top of the AC/DC here to the left side of the lighting bolt all the way down in a squiggly to the fire. So just drawing out with my brush a path here until I get it right. And I actually already did this. I'm just going to use the path that I did earlier, but just showing you basically what I did or how I'm doing it. I also believe the kind of brush here I'm using is a custom brush. I'm not exactly sure, but in any case, if you want to brush with these tapered edges, it's really simple. Just take a circle or the ellipse tool and then draw out an ellipse and just make it really, really wide like this and then turn it black. I don't think you need it to be black, but whatever, I'm turning it black. And then all you have to do is drag that ellipse into the brushes panel and then make it an art brush. Press OK, and boom. Just select that as a brush. And now you have this tapered brush. So pretty cool little tip in Illustrator. I don't know, maybe that's common knowledge. I suck at Illustrator, so I wouldn't know. Anyway, I have the line here, which is looking all right, but I do want it to taper a little bit more or get bigger towards the fire, sort of like it has in the reference here. It just gets, I don't know what the word is, not tapered, the opposite of tapered. It gets bigger, wider, as it approaches the fire or as it approaches the foreground, which makes sense. So I'm gonna take the width tool by doing Shift W on my keyboard, and then I can click anywhere on this line or the brush path that I created and just expand the width of that, which is pretty cool. So since I want it to get thicker towards the end here, I'm just gonna click here and expand the width to make it thicker, but that also thickens up the rest of it. So I do wanna maybe at another point here and then bring that down so we have a nice sort of taper going on, which is pretty cool. I also want it to be thicker towards this end as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that with the width tool. And this looks really bad as far as just a line goes, but once we do all the effects to this, it's obviously not gonna matter. So then all you have to do after that is select your line, do Command C to copy that, and then paste that into Photoshop. So I'm gonna go back into Photoshop, into Command V to paste it as a smart object. And now we have to create sort of a weird setup here. So I'm gonna drag this all the way towards the bottom of our layers, and I'm gonna make it white with a color overlay. So go ahead and click on the layer styles or double click on the layer to go to the layer styles and add a white color overlay. I'm gonna put this in a group, and I'm gonna name that group, I don't know, smoke. Then right on top of this layer, I'm gonna create a new layer and do Shift backspace on my keyboard. I wanna fill this layer with the contents of 50% gray. So I'm gonna press OK on that. Then we're gonna go to filter gallery, and we just want the grain here. So we can turn off the stamp. We just want the grain. I'm gonna turn the grain type to enlarged and turn up the intensity and the contrast a bit. It doesn't really matter too much, the settings. Just make sure you got a grainy gray layer. So I'm gonna press OK on that, and then I'm gonna set that layer to overlay. And then right above that, I'm gonna add a threshold adjustment layer. So right now that hasn't made any changes to that little swash of smoke there. But once we say blur this, you're gonna see what happens. So I'm selecting the line here that we made in Illustrator. I'm gonna go up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And as we turn the blur radius up, we can see what happens to this line. We now have that really cool noisy Xerox effect going on. The noise is actually a little bit too detailed, too small, so we do want to fix that up. So I'm just going to go to the gray layer. I'm going to name this grain actually, so we don't lose track. We just want to blur it by a few pixels. So go ahead and blur that grain layer by just a few pixels to make the grain a little bit larger and more pronounced. I'm gonna blur this by 2 pixels here. You can also duplicate that layer with Command J to get a more pronounced effect. Cool, so now the more we blur this line back here, the more of that effect will get going here. So let's say I turn it all the way up to something like, I don't know, 300 here or 250. We're kind of losing most of that line here because we're blurring it out. So let's just go ahead and add a levels adjustment right on top of this layer and crank that up until we see most of the line come back. And now we can go ahead and go back into that Gaussian blur and just turn the radius to something like, I don't know, 130 or something. I'm gonna go ahead and play with this levels again to get this where I want it. I think I do want a little bit more blur on this. Let me turn that up to, I don't know, 70 or something. I'm also just gonna change where this is a little bit, maybe even warp it a little bit. Let's bring that reference back so I can see. Just trying to sort of get this close to the reference here. So just sort of messing with the blur amount until I get a nice, really blurred out effect on the line here, so it looks more like the reference. I think I had it at a good point actually, but now we're sort of losing track of where that's going on the left end here. Now we're actually losing track of this part of that swash here. So I'm just gonna do a quick fix, but you probably want to go inside the smart object and just fix the lines, or just don't make this mistake in the first place. I'm just going to duplicate this layer and then sort of fill out that space by rotating this and, you know, sort of makeshifting the rest of the line there. And then I'll just layer mask that in. So I'll go ahead and make a layer mask on this, invert it with Command I, and then paint with a soft brush. All right, this is getting interesting. You might notice that the reference has a little bit more of a stochastic smoky, cloudy pattern here. We can actually recreate that as well. I'm gonna go ahead and hide the reference real quick. Let's make a new layer on top of these two layers here and go up to filter, render, and then clouds. And then let's just set this layer to overlay. And as you can see, that pretty instantly gets to this more stochastic pattern, but the clouds are just too big. Okay, so let's just make them smaller by doing Command T and dragging this inwards. So at about half the size, having that overlaid on this end of the smoke, kind of getting us to where we want it, but we want a little bit less of an effect. So let's just turn the opacity down to maybe 50 or 60. I don't know, maybe even 40, 30. Play around with that. You know, I'm gonna go with like 20, 30 here actually. Let's go with 24. So since we scaled it down, we now, only have it on one part of the smoke trail. So let's just go ahead and duplicate that with Command J and drag it to the other half of the smoke trail. We now have a more of a stochastic trail here. There's more ups and downs and bumps and ridges, and it just looks more grungy overall, which is what we wanted, and it's more close to the reference. So let me bring that reference back up here. It's also got some grungy bits in between and some splatters and whatnot, which you can go ahead and add if you have like a splatter brush or some grunge textures. But I want to keep this sort of using the least products that we can here. I do think there's some default brushes or some default splatter brushes in Photoshop. So just go through your brush panel and see if you have those. I think they're called Kyle's splatter brushes. And if you do have them, just go ahead and paint on some splatters if you like, if you want that extra detail. So I'm just painting on some splatters here just to give this some extra detail and depth and whatnot. Just getting it ever so closer to the reference. I can also do the opposite of this and sort of knock out parts with black. So painting in with a black splatter brush, might even just make the brush really small and paint in with black all over, sort of get more of a grainy look on top, which is kind of cool, but not exactly close to the reference. So I'm just getting carried away here. I'm just gonna turn the opacity down on this. All right, and now all we have left to do is add the text and add these little star elements towards or coming out of the fire here, which we could do very simply just in Illustrator with that brush I actually just made to get those sort of tapered lines, then just add a star at the end of them. So that's really easy, and the text is really easy as well. So we're pretty much almost done with this design. Let's do the star things first. So I'm gonna hide the reference here and go back into Illustrator. You can do this in Photoshop as well, but like I said, I'm on a trackpad, so the lines aren't gonna be smooth. It's gonna look like shit. If you don't have a trackpad, or if you're on a mouse and you're really good with the mouse, or you have a drawing tablet, feel free to use that instead. I'm gonna use Illustrator. So to do those little squiggly or those little cartoonish lines coming out of the fire with stars on them, you just gotta draw them one by one. So I'm back in Illustrator on this this screenshot of my design, and I'm using it just as a reference to draw these lines. So I'm just gonna take my brush and just start drawing. I'll make sure I have the right brush selected. And then I have the stroke on none and the fill on black, I think. All right, and then just start drawing out these lines one by one, and then we'll add a star to them in Photoshop, which you can do in Illustrator as well, but I just want them to be distressed, so I'm gonna do that in Photoshop. Yeah, really you're just drawing out lines, and then we're gonna copy this over to Photoshop. Very simple stuff. So I'm using these lines that I comped up before. I'm just gonna select all of them, do Command C to copy, and then paste that into Photoshop with Command V. I'll scale that up to size, and I want them to be white. So I'll go ahead and add a white color overlay in the layer styles here. All right, so I have the lines lined up with the fire now. It's looking nice. Then it's really just as simple as dragging a star vector or star PNG in here and aligning them to each of the individual lines. And for each of the different stars, you can add a nice different rotation to them or a different warp by holding down Command on your keyboard and dragging on any of these points within the transform controls. And that way you can sort of skew it and warp it differently for each line that you're dragging this on towards. So after the first star, you can just hold down Alt on your keyboard and drag that star, and it's going to duplicate that layer. You can drag that to the other line, and then repeat this process, rinse and repeat until you have a star for every line. So that's very simple. I really didn't want to dwell on that too much. Let's go ahead and knock out the text though. So the first one we're going to do is Let There Be Rock, which is very simple font, very simple layer style. Let's just do that real quick. So I'm going to take my type tool with T on my keyboard and type out Let There Be for the font. I'm just going to use an old classic Franklin Gothic, either regular or heavy. I don't even know if I have heavy for whatever reason. So I'm just going to use Franklin Gothic regular. Let's get the leading down a bit and then turn the size of the text up as well. Like I said, this isn't the exact font. I don't know what font they're using there, but it's just a sans serif. And from a distance, they all look the same. So I'm using Franklin Gothic regular. maybe give it a little skew or rotation by doing Command T on your keyboard to bring up the transform controls, and then just holding Command and clicking and dragging on one of these points just to give it some more life. Then let's add a layer style to this. So open up the layer styles, quickly add a color overlay. We'll set that to yellow, just like the yellow in the fire. And then we'll add a black drop shadow with the spread set to 100 so we have those harsh edges. That's getting pretty close, but we want a stroke on this too to fill out pretty much the rest of the outside of it. So I'm just gonna add a stroke here. Position on outside, we'll set the color to black and maybe set that a little bit lower, or mess with the drop shadow a bit, turn the distance down. And I think we're there already. Yeah, looking pretty cool. Could maybe even add some warp to this. I don't know if that's the warp of the t-shirt or in the actual design, but let's just go ahead and do a Command T on our keyboard and click on this warp button here to warp the text. And then I'm gonna choose, I think flag would look cool, just to get a little bit more distortion in here. Or maybe even like rise or something, I don't know. Let's see. I guess rise is kind of cool. We could do rise. All right, I'm gonna press the check mark there. Maybe rotate this a little bit. All right, looking good. All right, y'all. Unfortunately, my recording program just keeps crashing and I've lost like 15 minutes of footage by now. But I figured we're pretty much towards the end of this design anyway. So all I did was just add the rest of the text for the World Tour 77 and add some texture on here, which I'm gonna go into really quick, hopefully before my recording program crashes again. And this video is getting pretty long anyway, so I'll let y'all go eat lunch or something. I don't know. But anyway, so all I did was add that World Tour text at the bottom here and added those lightning bolts as well, which is literally just a PNG that I got off of Google, lightning bolt PNG. Put those on either side of the text. And then I added some texture, which by the way is from my new Warm Plastisol kit coming out very, very soon. It's probably not out at the time that I upload this video, but I have a new V2 version 2 of Warm Plastisol coming out with over 30 new Warm Plastisol vintage textures for you to use on your merch designs, and it's going to be great. It's got a ton of really cool textures. You're going to love it. So this is one of those textures. I just dragged it on top of here. And I also added a colorful layer all the way on top of this, set to sort of like an off-white creamy color. And then I set the blend mode of that to multiply just to get all the colors going on within this graphic to be more harmonious and just give it that more faded vintage feel. So this helps with that. The texture right now is actually just a black sort of PNG on top of the design. So let me go ahead and make that a layer mask on the actual design by selecting it and making a layer mask on the big group of the entire design. So once the design's all finished, you put all your layers in one big group, and then you do Command Alt or Option Shift E on your keyboard. That's gonna make a merge duplicate of everything on your canvas. Then we can go ahead and hide the design layer. We can also hide that merge duplicate. Then you want to make a colorful layer that is just a dark gray. So just set that to a dark gray since we're on a black background. We just want to see what we're doing here. Then go unhide your merge duplicate of your design and open up the layer styles panel and just go to the current layer and just drag the slider for the current layer blend if inwards a little bit until we see that all the black is knocked out of the design. And I actually made a mistake here. The layer mask was supposed to be on this layer, not the group layer of the design, but whatever. I could just duplicate that layer mask onto this layer as well. That way that texture is actually knocked out of the design and it's not ingrained into the design. So now we have our design on a transparent background. What we could do to sort of rasterize this is make a new layer and then just merge this layer with the new layer using Command E on our keyboard. And now you have your design on one layer, fully transparent. And we can drag this onto any mockup of our choice. I'm gonna go ahead and drag it onto my beloved Comfort Colors t-shirt mockup, which is available on the website if you wanna get this one, along with a ton of other mockups that you might find useful. Oh yeah. That is looking pretty damn nice, if I do say so myself. I also love how much depth that vintage texture adds along with the quality of this mock-up. So definitely keep your eyes peeled for Warm Plastisol version 2 coming out soon. And go pick up a mock-up or two on duransupply.com to see your designs really come to life. I don't know about y'all, but I'm getting hungry. So I hope y'all enjoyed this video. I think this is definitely one of the longer form videos I've done. I haven't edited this yet, but so far the footage I've recorded exceeds or almost reaches 2 hours. So that's a pretty damn long time. By the time I edit it, probably gonna be, I don't know, hour, maybe hour 30. So you definitely came along with me for the whole ride here. which is good. I wanted to make this beginner friendly, and I also wanted to show you pretty much every nook and cranny of every effect that I was doing for this design. So hopefully this is definitely one of those videos for you that even if you didn't exactly follow along with that design in specific, you can at least apply a lot of these techniques to other designs that you're doing, whether it be personal work or client work. I think there's a lot of hidden gems that we explored through that design. So here's the design that we were referencing and trying to recreate. And here is our recreation of that design. How'd I do? I think we did a pretty damn good job. This was truly a fun one. I'm gonna go smack down a sandwich right now, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace out.